to my mind is because I was watching The Message a couple months ago. Believe it or not, it did take me up until a couple months ago to see the movie The Message. Is there anyone here who hasn't seen it? Okay, a few of you. So you're like me. You had lived happily without ever watching The Message. By the way, I'm finding this a little bit annoying. Can you hear me without it? Yes? Okay, I'll try to be loud, inshallah. So anyway, for those of you who haven't seen it, The Message is a movie about the life of the Holy Prophet ﷺ, and the spread of Islam. So I'd say, most of us would say it's generally historically accurate. Obviously, you can't put everything in a 2-hour movie, 3-hour movie, whatever. But in general, it covers some of the basics. However, as you might guess from the topic today, I was struck by something as I was watching it. And that was, I felt there was really an absence of women in the movie. There was not much of a portrayal of women among the companions of the Holy Prophet ﷺ. Now, this is not to say there were no women in the movie. You've got Hind, who goes out on the battlefield and eats the liver of Hamza, and you know, she's crying and wanting revenge. Okay, so you have women in that portrayal. Now, granted, they did portray Hazrat Sumayya, the mother of Ammar ibn Yasir. They did show how she was killed for her faith. So that was definitely one of the events that happened to one of the women at that time that they did full justice to. But I felt in general most of the portrayal of women was a little bit two-dimensional, and they were just sort of sidelined. Maybe you'd see a woman here or there in the background. And I'm not criticizing the filmmaker, because my point today is not to come here and just give him a hard time. You know, I understand there may have been reasons for this. Obviously, there's a lot of stories from the time of the Sahaba. We can't tell all of these stories. Maybe it was a modesty issue. We have to remember this movie was made almost 30 years ago, I think more than 30 years ago. Even in the West at that time, you know, they were sort of coming out of the 50s and 60s, where in many countries there was an idea that women are just sort of glorified biscuit bakers. And, you know, nothing wrong with that, by the way. Cooking is an art, but I'm saying this was sort of the height of femininity, and there wasn't so much of an idea that women can or should be doing anything else. And I think that was still present among some people in the 70s as well, although, of course, society was changing a lot, too. And so, maybe these are some reasons for the portrayal. God knows. But one thing this sort of, we'll call it a one-dimensional portrayal of women does, is that it does leave a sort of, it sends a sort of subtext. That is to say, it gives a subconscious idea that, well, maybe women are not really so important in the spread of Islam. Maybe the female companions of the Holy Prophet ﷺ were just not very important to what was happening, and maybe Islam was just sort of a man's religion, as many times we see it portrayed today. And so it is very important to look at the subtexts we put forward in our portrayal of religion. And being that we're in a university environment, I'm sure many of you have discussed, for example, racial subtexts. You know, so for example, when you see always in the movies, it's the guy of African descent who's robbing the bank or shooting someone. You say, okay, there's a subtext. You're sending a racist subtext that people of African descent are criminals. You know, or beards. You know, all the time the guy with the bomb's got a big beard and got a distasha. So you're like, okay, I understand. They're sending a subtext that Muslims are terrorists. You know, they're not saying it, but it's just sort of a subconscious message. So I do think perhaps when we portray the history of early Islam, sometimes there may be a tendency to send a subtext that our gender was not tremendously important in that matter. So I'd like to suggest some ways that we could improve a movie like this, to sort of give perhaps a more balanced or inshallah more accurate or representative picture of some of the things that are known about women during the time of the Holy Prophet ﷺ. Positive things, inshallah. So, going back to the movie, and by the way, I'm by no means trying to bash the movie. I'm just sort of using it as a point of reference because many of us have seen it. One of the things that struck me was the absence of women in the mosque of the Holy Prophet in the holy city of Medina. You know, you have Hazrat Bilal getting up there and getting the call to prayer, but mostly you just see a kind of a horde of men rushing into the masjid. And you might see ladies here or there, but you don't really see a strong and regular presence of women in the Mosque of the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, and his family. And is this historically accurate or not? Were women praying in the Mosque of the Holy Prophet? Yes, they were praying in the Mosque of the Holy Prophet. Regularly. There's lots of hadith which describe how the women would come, they would pray behind the men, but they weren't even as generally we'd have it today, in a separate room or a partition. This is something that was done later. And incidentally, I'm not getting into the topic of gender segregation during worship. That's a completely different subject. But all I'm saying is that there was a contingent of women that would be there praying and participating actively in worship. And I do think this is an important subtext for us to think about, because we do know that in this era, in various Muslim countries, there are different opinions, culturally speaking, about whether or not women should be involved in attending houses of worship, public expression of religion or not. So I think this is a very vital area to pay attention to. We shouldn't just sort of ignore it and say, well, that's how we're showing it, because to our knowledge, this was not the situation at the time of the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So this is one thing. And additionally, in addition to the mere presence of women in the Masjid of the Prophet in the holy city of Medina, one of the things we do notice fairly regularly from a lot of the narrations about that time period is that it seemed like it was a rather open environment for women to get up and ask questions or give their comments or whatever they happened to have on their mind to say. So a woman could say something in front of the entire congregation to the Holy Prophet himself, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And it does appear that this sort of openness towards that sort of thing persisted throughout the first, at least the first 2 or 3 caliphates. So for example, there's any number of stories in which Umar ibn Khattab, for example, was corrected by a lady. So one that comes to mind, and I mean publicly corrected. So one of them that comes to mind is when he felt that the mahars were getting too high, a situation many people would say is a problem today. Women are demanding too much money to get married for them, for men to marry them. So he decided to fix the mahar at a certain amount. And then a woman said to him, to his face publicly, that the Holy Quran says if you've given kind of a big heap of gold to a lady, you can't take any of it back to her if you go and marry someone else. So she cites this ayah as proof that the second caliph does not have the right to put a limit on the amount of mahar one may receive for marriage, and he accepts this. He says, yes, you're right, this is an ayah, and he rescinded the law. The details of the story are not important, but what I'm trying to get at is it does seem that there was this sort of cultural openness to women having a say in what was going on. And of course, nowadays, I don't think we'd say that's the case. I mean, if this weren't a hall at Imperial College, and instead it were, some Islamic center or masjid, and maybe we have a partition over here, and I'm sitting over here, the sheikh says something here, I can't sort of poke my head over and go, excuse me, sheikh, I didn't agree with that last point, or, can you repeat that again? People will be like, shh, shh, go back to the ladies' side, haram, hijab, sister. And I'm not saying incidentally we should necessarily be making a scene or something, but I am saying the culture was a bit different then, and maybe we don't always portray the culture at that time the way it appears to have been according to what has been recorded. So, I hope that's clear. I'm not trying to give a religious recommendation, but I'm just saying it does appear things were a little bit more open in that time period than perhaps we are always portraying them. So that's one area where I think we could perhaps avoid sending subtexts in our portrayal of the companions of the Holy Prophet. Another area with regards to women, and of course these are all with regards to women, given the subject tonight, is how women independently chose to come to the message. That is to say, women weren't just sort of coming to Islam as baggage. Their husband converts, so it's like, oh, okay, dear.